Increasingly, we are living in an alien culture. We are exiles in a country that feels increasingly out of sorts with our faith tradition. Now, you can mitigate that experience by hanging out with Christians. You can mitigate that experience by staying in the subculture. But if you're actually working in a major city, or working in a major university, or working in major industries like Hollywood, that is not easily possible. And so we have a situation where the church has not actually fully come to grips with the fact that they are now a minority voice in a majority secular culture, and they have to start acting differently if they're going to be effective within that changed cultural context. How do I negotiate and navigate my faith in an increasingly hostile and uncomprehending professional world? So what we're going to be talking about in the course of our time together is what does it mean to be an exile, and then how do we be an effective exile? So if you're tweeting, the main takeaway is that you are an exile, and this is a good thing. So I think it's time to embrace the fact, not lament the fact that that's where we are, because it's actually going to be to everybody's best interest if that's what we do. Now, this is a particularly confusing time to be a follower of Christ. We have got to figure out how to be effective Christians after the collapse of Christendom. That is, after the collapse of all the old structures that we used to count on to provide some bearing for us socially and spiritually. We're in a post-Christian cultural context. Most of us, if you're immersed, genuinely immersed, feel torn. We kind of pull between my church community and my work world, and it feels kind of inauthentic because I'm just so torn. So how do I actually live into that space in an effective way? Mark Laberton, who's the president of Fuller Seminary, wrote a piece recently, and he said he calls this the gift of being an exile. That for the very first time, we're able to kind of strip away the kind of civil religion, Christianized American dream wrapped in a Christian bow, and actually ask the authentic biblical question that gets down to brass tacks: who are we? And what are we really supposed to be about? The church tends to vacillate between being a bully and asserting their will over other people, or playing the victim. So they move from being a majoritarian to being resentful and woe is me. And almost always we pit ourselves with non-believers in a we-they culture war confrontation that is unhelpful and doesn't actually look for the best interests of others. Let me be pretty clear about what I'm trying to say. Are Christians operating today on a level playing field? What have I said? No. Will we be discriminated against unfairly because we're Christians? Yes. Do we need to actually acknowledge the fact that we are now aliens we are a minority voice within a larger secular, majority secular culture? Yes. But that doesn't give us warrant to use attitudes of victim language or resentment. So we have to be very, very careful about that, because a lot of the things that's being done around us are simply reinforcing the stereotypes that non-believers have of Christians, and frankly, we need a better way. Now, Paul reminds us in Philippians that our citizenship is in heaven, which he states in order to remind us that our ultimate loyalties, our ultimate attachments have to be to Him, to Christ, and to His kingdom. So when it comes to this world, even under the best of situations, we should be 1 foot in, 1 foot out. I just think this is a wonderful time, absolutely fabulous time to be a follower of Jesus Christ, because we're now moving into a world that's uncharted. And a lot is at stake. I mean, the civilizational order is at stake. A little history lesson. Some of you recall from European history that the Enlightenment in the 17th century occurred as a way of overthrowing the ancient regime of the vestiges of a medieval world. So in politics and economics and in church, it was all centered in France. It was the rise of the Enlightenment with Comte, Derrida, Voltaire, and others, was simply a way of overcoming the ancient regime. And what emerged from that was something called modernity, modern life. And modernity has now had a 200 and some year, 300 year run. And now modernity is exhausted. It's crumbling, and its premises are being abandoned, most quickly by millennials. So millennials are the first generation to actually be post-Enlightenment in their orientation. With the Enlightenment came a way of seeing reality in bifurcated either-or categories, black and white categories. The younger generation today rejects that in favor of a both-and kind of framing of reality, which is actually closer to the truth. Reality is actually more like 50 Shades of Gray than black and white. What's happened today is that modernity is collapsing. And the natural pole of the collapse of modernity is nihilism. And nihilism is actually going to be very bad for human flourishing. And so the question then becomes, how do we replace the sources of social life, the moral framework to actually have a community life and culture, with the collapse of modernity and the rise of something that is not yet fully formed, right? David Kinnaman, in his book, You Lost Me, the subtitle of that book is Why Young Christians Are Leaving the Church and Rethinking Faith. He says that a lot of young people today fall into three categories: nomads, prodigals, and exiles. Now, close to 60% of young people who attend churches, teens who are in their young life groups, they drop out of any church involvement after they go to college. So 50% of young adults in America no longer identify as Christians, 15% consider themselves having no religion, and 30% never go to church or synagogue. Nomads are people who've walked away from the church but still consider themselves Christians. You probably know lots of people that way. For them, faith has become very individualistic, very private, and their beef is largely with the institutional church. They're not particularly upset with Jesus, but they are pretty pissed off about their parents and their parents' church in particular. They're very negative to the judgmental black and white thinking, and they are particularly incredulous over the identification of conservative Christianity with right-wing politics. And so for them, they just basically opt out. So nomads try to actually maintain their faith without any connection to the church. That's actually a position that's theologically untenable and psychologically improbable, because we're just not that wired that way. We're wired to be social beings, and we need the community of faith to be around us. Lone Range Christians over time become functional atheists, or they become prodigals. So you stay nomad long enough, right? You're not going to stay nomad long. You're going to end up being a prodigal, or a functional prodigal. Now, we have to actually commend these kids, though, these young people, because they have maintained some nominal relationship to the faith of their fathers, but most of them just feel trapped. They don't actually have an on-ramp to a more vibrant faith that makes sense and that's cast in some kind of a human frame. So they don't really know what to do, and so they do the best they can without creating too many waves. And over time, most of them end up being prodigals. And prodigals, like their New Testament counterparts, left their father's home and gone to a far country to sow wild oats. They no longer describe themselves as Christians. And this is a much easier thing for people today, because actually, in another era, it was a professional liability to say you were an atheist. Today, thanks to Bill Maher and Greg Gaffin, it's hip, cool, and edgy to be considered a non-believer or an atheist. So now, of course, it's just 180. Now there's a stigma for being an Orthodox Christian and not for being an atheist. So it's okay to be a prodigal. There's not a heavy price to pay among your friends if you say you're a prodigal. You're going to be applauded. And then there are the exiles, and that's where most of us find ourselves. These are people who are still invested in their church, still invested in their faith, and they're torn between it and the world they're trying to navigate, both in their professional lives, at work, and among their friends. I mean, after a while, it's just like enough already, and you end up thinking, this is really hard for me to maintain my integrity as a person, and this tension I feel between wanting to have a vibrant relationship with Jesus Christ and His church, and the challenges of trying to navigate that in my professional world and in the wider world. Now, the Bible actually gives us some examples, some guidelines on how to be an exile. In the book of Jeremiah, you have a situation where he actually gives very specific directions to God's people about how to be an exile. So if you want to know how to be an exile, pay attention to what he says in Jeremiah 29. It says, "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to those that I've carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon." We might note here that your status as exile is a providential project. God has carried you there. This is not some crisis of the culture. This is right where you're supposed to be. This is at the heart of God's will for you. So what are you supposed to do? Well, you carried exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Well, you're to build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce, marry and have sons and daughters, and find wives for your sons, and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number and do not decrease. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, that is Babylon, you too will prosper. Now, if the American Evangelical Church could just pay attention to this passage, we'd be in a much better situation. But this is almost 180 degrees the opposite of what we're doing. So the first thing that God tells these people, for those of us who are exiles in American Babylon, is embrace your circumstances. Stop fighting it, settle down, and align your purposes with the place where I've sent you. So if you're a missionary and you're sent to Africa or Korea, and all you do is bitch and moan about the fact that you're in this country and it's so terrible, how effective are you going to be? Not effective at all. Now, I've had to actually do some self-examination on this particular point because I moved from Boston to Philadelphia. Anybody go to Penn here? Anybody go to Penn here? All right, so forgive me. And it was a difficult move. My wife cried. I mean, we lived 1 mile from the ocean on the south shore of Boston. We had this lovely cape. Oh, my word, we loved Boston. Everything about Boston I loved. All of my professional team's loyalties remain in Boston. I actually have a sweatshirt. I got it at Christmas. I'm embarrassed to say, but it says, I live in Philadelphia, but all my teams are in New England. Phillies, Flyers, Eagles. I mean, really. So this is what I've actually had to come to terms with. This is a bad attitude, and this is not what God would have me do because I read this passage in Jeremiah. And so I will say that I'm rooting with passion for Villanova tomorrow night, and that I am going to go out and buy a Phillies hat and start wearing it. That will be a very big spiritual exercise for me. But God cannot use you if you have a negative attitude about the place to which He's called you. That's the bottom line. The second thing He says in this passage in Jeremiah is to align your future with the future of the place where God has called you, even to 2 generations. Now, we're a highly mobile society, so we don't have a very strong sense of place. But God calls us to get married, to plant gardens, build homes, raise grandchildren, all in the place of our exile, all in Babylon. So when we connect our future to a place, we care about it in a different way. And the other thing is that we need to change our metrics, what we measure. What the passage says is that you need to pray for and do everything you can to help the institutions of Babylon succeed. Because when the institutions of Babylon succeed, you will prosper. Now, most churches are not in the business of measuring how they're actually influencing the center institutions around them. They're measuring what they're doing, not how they're investing in the institutions of Babylon. You have to love the place and care for the place you're called to if that is the metrics you're using, that you are actually praying for and working for the peace and prosperity of the place to which you are exiled. Now, how we do that will be the subject of tomorrow's address. But think of Patrick of Ireland, St. Patrick. He was, as a child, younger than 10, kidnapped and taken as a slave to Ireland. He was from a noble family in England, and he was taken to Ireland and put in slavery, where he was basically a slave sheep herder, and he was there for years. Late in his teen years, he figured out a way to escape, and he escaped by the skin of his teeth, and he got back to England, and then God called him back to Ireland. He got trained and went to school, and God called him back to Ireland. Now, he's probably the most effective missionary in church history because he had an intuitive childhood knowledge of Druid culture. So his exile was the blessing that allowed God's kingdom to be expanded there. So where do we find in the Bible examples of people who remain faithful to their orthodoxy, but aggressively empathetic to their non-believing friends and passionately caring for their secular companies? Well, we might not think of it in a world of Stephen Jobs and Elon Musk, but Daniel is the first name that should come to our mind. He was a literal exile. He was exchanged for other members of the Jewish nobility in 597 BC as a tribute from Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, to Nebuchadnezzar. And if you want to picture this scene, all you have to do is go back to the movie 300. That's what we're talking about. This was the moment that he was called to show what he was made of. Now, if we're going to be effective as exiles, we have to be a certain kind of person. There's 7 characteristics of Daniel. I'm going to mention them, and then we're quitting. And then tomorrow we'll talk about what do we do as an exile. But tonight I want to talk about who do we be? Who are we to be as a person if we're going to be effective as an exile? And God gives us a very, very clear example, and there's 7 characteristics. The first thing about him is that he's cosmopolitan. So he's not living and oriented to the Jewish ghetto. He's moved to the center of cultural influence, namely the court of Nebuchadnezzar. And there for 3 years, like being in an Ivy League school, he's taught all the language and literature of the Babylonians. He becomes an expert on Babylonian culture. So the thing we notice about Daniel is that his attitude toward his culture, his exiled home, was not adversarial. This became his new God-ordained missional platform. His on earth as it is in heaven was Babylon. He was committed to making Babylon great, and he dedicated his life to that task. But the second thing we notice about him is that he's conscious. He never lost sight of where or whose he was. He developed daily practices that reminded him of his distinctiveness from his surrounding culture. So he told them that he would refuse to eat the royal food and wine, sticking instead to a vegan diet, which proved to be healthier. So he was vegan before vegan was cool. But that's kind of a small thing, but it's kind of a thing you do 3 times a day that reminds you of, and it's not I suspect that the king's court, the gourmet chefs there and the wine, I would suspect it was a pretty big spread. So his little choice was a conscious choice that he made every day, and it reminded him of whose he was and where he was. He also made a conscious choice of praying 3 times a day, and that also helped him remember. The third thing is he was conversational in his relationship with God. He talked over all the affairs of his public life and private life. There was no compartmentalization, none of this sacred, secular faith work. It was all a part of his daily conversation with God. Reminds me of what Dallas Willard said: we must come to the place where we comfortably think of God as a reality that is actually a part of our world. Rather than church and work. It's all, he would just have a conversational relationship about everything with God. And that made him an ambassador of heaven in the midst of Babylon. The fourth thing is he was companioned. So he was cosmopolitan, conscious, conversational, and companioned. He was not a loner. He surrounded himself with three close friends whose professionalism, values, and calling matched his own. If you don't, in your place of exile, have compatriots in purpose, kingdom purpose, that would be the first thing I would urge you to pray about. Now, these four compatriots distinguished themselves. One of the things we learn is that it's always peer preference before it is peer pressure. That is, your closest friends reveal the character of your heart more than any other choice you make. And as they reveal the character of your heart, they then reinforce the direction of your heart. So we need to pick good friends to be around us, because we are actually a lot weaker than we think we are. That's why Jesus said, lead us not into temptation. The reason that phrase is in there is remember who you are. You're not really very strong. You cannot do this by yourself. And so we need companions. The spiritual language is called accountability partners, but companions will work. The fifth thing is that they were competent. I once heard of a group of students at Dartmouth who thought it was spiritual to get B's for Jesus. Because, to get A's, you actually have to work too hard, and it cuts into your work you can do for Christ and His kingdom. That's garbage. These people were exceedingly competent. They excelled in their studies and their professionalism. In fact, it says in the scripture, in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom, end quote. Daniel 1:20. This organization is one that has fostered a kingdom aspiration around people who are enormously competent. The intellectual horsepower represented in that room a few minutes ago is beyond anything that I can comprehend, and probably one of the smartest places I have been in the last several years. But lots of times Christians just don't have the education, the social graces, the innovative creativity, or the professional acumen of their non-believing friends, and so they're just left out. That is not the case with a person like Daniel. So we need to be competent. We need to bring more to the table than the people around us just because we have a certain kingdom mindset. The sixth thing to say about Daniel is that he was clear. He was not a closeted Christian. It was widely known that Daniel was a follower of the God of heaven, is how it was described. By the way, lest I forget to mention, there is a female counterpart to Daniel known as Esther, who demonstrated the same characteristics that Daniel represented. So, like Tim Tebow or Jeremy Lin, Daniel was known for his faith and his humility. He had an opportunity when he answered the king's, addressed the king's, was able to answer the king's dream. He could have taken credit for it. And he said he took no credit for it at all. He did not use his spiritual insight to boast his, to somehow make himself look good in front of his boss. He did none of that. He simply did it for service. And he was given increasing honor and increasing responsibility, as you might. And this gets us to 7. And that soon, if you try to operate in the real world in this manner, at some point you're going to be put to the ultimate test. Just count on it. Might as well talk about it because it's going to happen. And pretty soon you're going to be either thrown into a fiery furnace or into a lion's den. So faithfulness will also often lead to a decisive moment It did for Daniel, and it will for you and me. So he was 7 committed. At some point, you're going to have to demonstrate with your life everything that you said, that you're going to put God first in his kingdom. That is going to come. You don't necessarily have to go look for it. Here, kitty, kitty, kitty. I mean, you don't have to look for the lions. They will come. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and these things will be given to you. So they would not bow down to the idols. They would not cease their habit of prayer, even when their lives were at stake. Now, a little insight here to their theology. They did, in the midst of this, they did not know how this was going to pan out. But they knew that they had to hold the line on integrity. So this is what they said to Nebuchadnezzar. They said, if we're thrown into the blazing fire, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of God you have set up. Now, that is not something we hear preached about very often. So the fact of the matter is, the outcome of faith can lead equally to remaining untouched by lions or being bitten in two. We have the story of Corrie ten Boom, and we have the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. The common element in both is the outcome is a faithful commitment to God that leaves the outcome up to God. So it's important for us to actually brace ourselves ahead of time for the kinds of things that life's going to throw at you. You live long enough, we're promised by Jesus. The foundations of your faith will be tested. The water will rise, the wind will blow, and the house will be shaken, and only that which is built on the rock will actually stand. So at some point in your career, push is going to come to shove. And you might as well have thought about it ahead of time and not be surprised, because when it comes, you can say, oh, I'm all over this. I thought about it at the Nexus conference. Although it'll be a lot, I mean, life is life can be really, really painful and difficult. So let's not pretend otherwise. So to sum up, we're not living in a culture where casual adherence to Americanized Christianity is going to suffice. What we need today is Daniel and Esther's. We need special forces in kingdom service. This is a time that calls us for an age of spiritual heroes. We're at this pivot point in culture. And it's particularly the young people. It's particularly the millennials that are going to have to carry the weight to figure all this out. We have every hope that God is up to the task of transforming us into men and women who are up to our particular moment of history. But frankly, I can't think of a more exciting time to be alive as a follower of Jesus Christ, because so much is at stake, and I have utmost confidence, particularly in millennials, because you have an instinctive understanding that you are living in exile, and it's a good thing. Thank you.